What's going on? This is Mike McFarland from 3MG, Mike McFarland Marketing Group. I don't even know if Kim and I would even refer to us as Mike McFarland Marketing Group anymore. We're very much 3MG. 3MG, thank you for checking me out today. Welcome to Mike Versus. Now, for those of you who have not heard of this concept, Mike Versus was originally a YouTube idea that I had where I was going to make a series of YouTube videos comparing Eloqua, Pardot, Marketo, and HubSpot. And I did one. I did the I did the welcome program one back in, I want to say January, maybe February. And then it got really quiet. And I learned some things. One, it takes a lot of time to make a 10-minute YouTube video or a 12-minute YouTube video. And it's fun. It is fun. There's a lot of prep work that actually goes into it, which is not a bad thing. It's a good learning experience. But I was finding that I was kind of drowning myself in what I needed to do versus just doing it. And so the idea came to me, it was like, I really still want to do Mike Versus, but I'm going to do it live. And I like this because it's off the cuff. What you see is what you get. There's no editing. This is it. But it still goes along the same kind of enthusiasm of what Mike Versus was supposed to be, which is showcasing and comparing functionality between Eloqua, Marketo, Pardot, and HubSpot, or Pardot, whatever you want to call Pardot now, whatever you want to call Marketo now, whatever you want to call Eloqua now. They all got different names. Anyway, I'm old school. I keep it old school. We keep those names in place. I did a live stream last week. Now, mind you, I did it at 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night and had a few folks join, which was really cool. And we focused on lead scoring. That was a beefy one. That was about a 45-minute live stream going through how to do lead scoring in these different platforms, the differences, not talking about what's better, not talking about what's worse. That's not for me to decide. I'm just here showcasing the functionality as I see it, which is another really important point that I want to make in all of this, is that I know that there are tons of ways to do different things in these platforms. I'm one of those guys that likes to do things sometimes not out of the box. I like to create my own automation for something or my own process for something. What we focus on Mike Versus is what you see is what you get. So this is what comes out of the box with your subscription to these platforms. And there's no bells or whistles. There's no fancy things you need to change. This is what you get. And so today we're going to focus on forms. Now, forms are an important part of any marketing automation platform. They're basically the bridge from getting people on your website, on a landing page, from an ad into your marketing automation database. And all four of these platforms do have form functionality, and all four of these platforms have different ways of doing forms. But at the end of the day, they all achieve the same thing. I'm just making sure I'm being truthful with that statement. They all achieve the same thing. They all allow data to come from one source to another, and that secondary source is to your database. And so while we are going through this, know that the idea of forms, again, resonates across all of these marketing automation platforms pretty similarly, but they all do things a little bit differently. Why don't we take a look at how this works? Okay, let's start with HubSpot. Let me jump in, take a quick peek. Now, you'll notice that when we look at HubSpot, they kind of start you off with, well, what type of form do you want to create? Which I actually really like. It's a cool idea. Are you wanting to embed a form on your website? Are you wanting to do just a blank page with a form on it, maybe a little bit of styling here and there? Do you want your form to slide in, slide out, do all these really cool things? For the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to create an embedded form. So this is basically where you can create a form in HubSpot and then you can put that form onto your website. Now, I'm not going to show the code part of it because I don't want, people trying to ping my instances with form data. So we won't go that far, but we're going to walk you through the form editor and talk a little bit about what works there. So we're going to start with an embedded form. And And then another nice thing with HubSpot, and you'll see this throughout the other automation platforms as well, is they give you kind of some jumping off points or starting points. Maybe you don't know where to start. Maybe you don't know what fields to ask for. Maybe you don't know this kind of best practices that go into building a certain type of form. So you have these templates available to you in your instance, but we're going to start with just a blank template. So we're starting from scratch, and by scratch, we're starting with email directly on our form editor page. So on the left hand side here, this is basically our, I don't want to say properties, but our little nav to go through and get some of this form set up. And right here, we have our properties that are fields within HubSpot that we can use on our HubSpot forms. You'll notice that some other platforms do this piece a little bit differently. They don't always just rely on fields that you have created in your marketing automation platform. You can actually just create fields specifically for your form. We'll get to those here in a second. But for the purposes of this, I can go through and I can look at all the different properties that I have within my HubSpot hub and determine what fields I want to add to my form. So I want to add, say, first name, I'm going to drag it over. I want to add last name, I'm going to drag it over. And when you click on the fields, you get the properties of this field. How do you want this field to act? How do you want this field to accept or reject data? And again, all of these platforms will have some form of validation that typically goes into this, which is a really important piece to make sure that you're collecting the data that you want, and people aren't just putting random shit in your form that you don't care about. So validation can go a long way. So with first name, for example, I can say, you know what, I want to make this field required, or I want to make this hidden. I'm not going to make it hidden, but this is where you can capture data in a form field that's not actually shown on your form. We won't go too deep into that right now, but you can make this field required. Change the label. So do you want it to be first name? Do you want it to be just name? Well, no, because you have a last name field and you don't want people to assume. So we'll leave this as first name. You can enter in some help text. So if people need to understand what they're filling in, you can add that in. You can also add in placeholder text so that people know that you're supposed to put something in, or you can put a default value in case people don't put anything in. You have all of these options, and you can do this on a field by field basis, which is really nice. You don't have to basically say this cluster of fields all have this validation on it, or this form as a whole has this sort of validation on it. I mean, we do in a sense, but we're breaking it down field by field to ensure that the data that we want to capture within those fields is captured accurately. I can also add some progressive logic, so progressive profiling to these fields as well. So, for example, if I already know a value in this field, so in first name, I can choose to leave it on the form, or I can replace it with a progressive field. And that progressive field is basically going to take the first name field off of the form and add in a different field that we don't have any data on, which is really cool. We start asking for information that we need versus information that we potentially already have. And so you'll typically see this sort of scenario with things like, especially in HubSpot, but I've seen with my customers, is they'll do this for country. So if the country is United States or Canada, then you can show a state province field, for example. Maybe if you're having a certain industry and you want to capture a sub industry, you can do the same thing there. If you just want to limit the amount of fields that you actually have on your form, you can do that as well. So that's what progressive profiling allows you to do. And you can do that directly within the editor here within HubSpot. And so you can go through, you can add your fields in, you can go through, you can select if you want to do any sort of progressive profiling here as well. Or you can also go through and create new fields specifically for your form that also will then turn into contact properties in your database, because your data needs somewhere to live. So if you're going through your form and you realize, oh shit, I forgot to create this field, have no worries. You can go in and you can create a new field directly in your form of different types. And so you can see you have radio buttons, you have drop downs, you have number fields, you have file uploads. I remember this being such a hot topic, specifically for one of my customers when this was way back in the day. And it's cool to see that this sort of functionality is kind of native in different marketing automation platforms now. You can add images. There's a whole bunch of different elements or field types that you can add to your HubSpot form here as well. So you have your existing properties, you can search for them, you can create net new ones as well. Really powerful. Up here in the center part of the screen, we can start to go through and look at what we want this form to do potentially after data comes in. So do we want to show a thank you message? Do we want to redirect them to another page? Do you want to set them as a certain life cycle stage? We're not going to get into life cycle stages in HubSpot because that's a whole other conversation, but you can set life cycle stages as well. Do you want to get a notification email whenever someone submits the form? You can go through and do that. What language do you want this in? What campaigns in HubSpot do you want this tied to? And then down here at the bottom, which is actually a really important piece, is you can choose whether or not you want to create new contacts based on the email address that's being submitted, because email address is the unique identifier. You can set people as marketing contacts. Again, another concept in HubSpot where you can be a contact in the database, but not necessarily a marketing contact, in the sense that we can't communicate with you, but we can have your information in the database. You can add a link to reset the form. So if someone realizes they put in all the wrong information, you can clear it. Or you can pre-populate the contact fields that we have data on the form to make sure that people where we have their information don't have to fill it out again. And again, you can also substitute this with progressive profiling as well. We have a little bit of styling that you can go through and do as well. So if you want to go through and change the look and feel of your form, you can do that here. You can also go through and change some of the colors, change some of the font sizes, change some of the fonts. All of this is baked directly into the platform. So if you're not a web developer, if you're not a web designer, if you don't know a little bit of HTML and a little bit of CSS, HubSpot gives you options at the gate to make sure that you get the form looking as close to as you want it to look, because it might never be absolutely perfect. And then lastly, you can add some simple automation to your form. And this is a relatively new feature, as you can tell by the new label up here. You can go through and basically say, when someone submits this form, I want to trigger this specific workflow to do A, B, and C. Maybe it's sending an autoresponder. Maybe it's adding to a list. Maybe it is syncing to a campaign in Salesforce. Maybe it is creating a task. Whatever you can automate in a workflow in HubSpot, you can trigger off of this form submission. So again, you have an idea here in terms of what types of workflows you can create. You can create a simple workflow, which basically just sends a confirmation email, or you can create your own, start from scratch and add in the pieces that you want. So that's something you can do as well. You can also build automations outside of the form editor. You don't have to do it here. You can build your workflow and then just set up your form submission as a trigger into that workflow to do what you need to do. And you can change the name of your form up here as well. Now, when you're done your form, you can update or publish your form. And basically what that does is it exposes some embed code that you can copy and paste and give to your web developer to put onto your website. Or if you're using HubSpot as your CMS, there's no code that you need to do there. You simply just select the form that you want to have on your page and you can watch it from there. Pretty cool stuff. That's HubSpot. 13 minutes. Wow. 13 minutes to talk about HubSpot forms. So let's see if we can get through the next little bit at the same sort of cadence. If there are folks on the chat, I don't think that there are. I feel like I'm talking to myself right now, but that's totally cool because we're going to have this as a replay so you can watch this later. If you do have questions, let me know in the chat. Let me know in the comments on this replay. Definitely here to answer them as best as I can. If I can't answer them, then I'll help you navigate to figure out how to get those answers as well. But here we are. Forms, HubSpot, good stuff. Let's move over to Pardot. I like using Pardot Classic still. I know you can do Pardot Lightning in Salesforce, and it's all great. It's all fine. It's all good. I still like pardot.com. Keep it old school. I think they're like one of the OG B2B SMB enterprise marketing automation platforms that still, actually, I think Eloqua still does too. They keep it old school with that pardot.com domain, which I'm sure will go away at some point, but that's cool. Starting with forms in Pardot, like in HubSpot and like you'll see in Eloqua and like you'll see in Marketo as well, you can create, basically there's two different types of forms that you can create within HubSpot. I'm going to create a basic form that you would put onto a landing page, but you can also create something called form handlers. And form handlers are where you've built a form by scratch through code on your website or in your CMS, and you want that to post back directly into Pardot without actually creating a stylized form within Pardot to use. You can create a form handler. And basically what that allows you to do is update the form action or the destination as to where data is being submitted from that form and pointing it back to a specific instance of Pardot into a specific form so that you can do all the automation there without actually having to build the form from scratch within Pardot. You still have to build the form. You still have to go through and create all the fields that you want to use for it to capture, but it's a slightly different way of doing it. Really popular way of doing forms is as well. Especially, I see it more on the enterprise side where you've got specific looks and feels that you have of your forms. If you're reposting data too, another popular way to get that data back into Pardot as well. So check out form handlers. But for the purposes of this walkthrough, we're going to walk through just standard forms, basic standard forms, just like we did in HubSpot. So I'm going to go and add a form. I'm going to give my form a name. We'll call this testing Mike McFarland form. I can add some tags to it for searchability, which is a really powerful thing to do. I can associate this to a campaign as well. I can determine where this form is going to point to. So right now it's going to go to pardot.com. Don't worry about that right now. I can also go through and folder it. Again, not going to worry about that right now. Going to click next. Oh, I got to choose a campaign. This is real life. Let's see. Do I have any campaigns in here? Yay. Let's choose that and go next. Okay. So again, much like HubSpot, Pardot goes and gives us a few standard fields that we potentially want to ask for. And again, you can pick and choose what fields you want to add. You can go and you can add new fields that are in your prospect database or in your prospect database, and pick what fields that you potentially want to use on your form here as well. If you have custom fields, you can use those custom fields too. If you want to load default data into your field. So this is really powerful if you're using like a drop down, for example. This type here, let's just see. I don't know if I have this set in my instance, but let's just take a quick peek. Yeah, I don't think it did anything. That's cool. But this is really, if you've got pick lists, you can load pick list values into your form field, which is a really cool thing to do. You don't have to go through and put them all in manually as you see fit. Let's see. Yeah, I didn't add any. But I can go through and pick. If I have a pick list, I can go through and pick what I want to have, which is cool. So when I add a field, I can determine what label I want to use, what type of field is it. So again, we looked at those different types of fields in HubSpot as well. And what's the data format? Is it a text? Is it a number? Is it an email? Are we doing any sort of validation to see, is this from like a B2B, not a B2B, like a non-public email domain like Gmail or Yahoo or Hotmail or AOL or whatever the kids are using these days. You can go through and pick your format here as well. You can also add in error messages. So again, if you want this field to be required, for example, you can put in a certain error message to say like, hey, this field's required. Put in your first name. You can't submit the form elsewise. If you want to reference any CSS classes, you can do that here as well from a look and feel standpoint. So if you want to get a little fancy with your form fields, toss a little CSS onto your page, reference that CSS in the CSS classes here. Nice, pretty form field. Always display even if previously completed. Again, we saw this in HubSpot as well. If we already have information in this field, we can choose whether or not we want to show this field or not. You can choose if you want to pre-fill these fields with any data that we already have as well. So if we already have a first name, then you can put a first name of that person into the field as well. Because I have this selected as a dropdown, you can go through and you can figure out what field values do you want to put into this field. So I'm going to go and add a new value of, say, business services. And I clicked the wrong button. My apologies. I can go through and continue to add more values if I see fit, which I'm not going to do, but you get the idea. And again, you can do this in Pardot as well. We are in Pardot. You can do this in HubSpot as well. And you can do this in all the marketing automation platforms, like you will see. So we can also use some progressive profiling here as well. So for example, if someone has a certain value in a field, we can go through and say, okay, only show this field if the prospect already has data in a certain other field as well. So we can say only show industry if we have email, for example. So a little bit different than how HubSpot does it, a little bit different than how Eloqua does it, a little bit different than how Marketo does it, but that's cool. They all have this progressive profiling functionality in here as well. You can also make fields dependent. And that's kind of what we were talking about in HubSpot, where you can go through and say if your country is equal to Canada or US, then show a state field. Well, you can do the same thing here. So you can create these dependencies to say, show these fields if other field values are selected, which is another really cool piece of functionality. The reason I want to showcase all of this, and I want to showcase this all in all of the marketing automation platforms, because data integrity is super important to what we're doing as marketers. We don't market well if we have shitty data. And so by making sure that when data is coming into our database, we're doing it in an accurate way. We're doing it in a way that is not intrusive for the person who's providing that information. We're doing it in a way that is easy for someone to do it. And we're doing it in a way that we're capturing the values that we care about. That becomes really important. So yes, we're talking about little nitty gritty tactical elements within a field setup, but it's really important when it comes to data quality. If you have shitty data coming in, you're going to have shitty data coming out, feeding everything else. So forms are a great way to kind of set up those gates or set up those processes to make sure that when you're using a form, because a lot of people don't like using forms these days, or they say forms are bad. They're bad. Not so bad. But if you are using forms, it's important to go through and do these little setups to make sure that you are capturing the data as accurately as possible. So again, we can go through and add additional fields if we want. We can make fields required as we see fit. We can move fields around so we can reorder them. And again, you can do that on HubSpot as well. I know I didn't show that here, or I didn't show that in HubSpot. You can do that in HubSpot as well. But yeah, you can go through, add the fields that you want to add, and then move on to your next step. If I'm going to be completely honest, I'm not super familiar with this part of the form process. I don't typically do a lot of styling of forms directly within Pardot. I'll typically do it outside of it, but that's cool. You can do a lot of styling in here. So again, if you're not a web designer, if you're not doing CSS, if you're not doing some HTML, you can go through and figure out some basic form styling to meet your needs. So what size of the font do you want to use? What color font do you want to use? What type of font do you want to use? Where do you want the label? Some basic kind of just moving things around to get the form looking as good as you want it to look without getting into any sort of custom code as well. Let's choose a template here just to move forward. Completion actions. So this was the equivalent to what we were just looking at in HubSpot, where you could run a basic workflow or run a workflow after a form submission. Same idea, same concept here, except we call them completion actions. So for example, we can go through, we can set our thank you content. So we can say, hey, thanks for submitting your form, depending on what the call to action is, depending on what the people were submitting the information for. They could go through and then see a message that says, hey, maybe we'll follow up with you in 24 to 48 hours, or here's a link to your download, or something in those regards. You can control that messaging all within the form here. You can choose to redirect people as well. But most importantly, we have our completion actions. And this is where you can add some basic automation to when someone completes the form, what do you want to do? And you can do the same thing with form handlers as well. So when someone submits into a form handler, you can have completion actions that happen here as well. So, for example, I may want to send someone an autoresponder. So I'll choose what email I want to send them. And as soon as someone submits this form, we'll send out email one or whatever you call your email. Maybe you want to add one where we add to a specific campaign because they've responded to an offer or they've responded to your call to action. Maybe we want to adjust their lead score. We talked about lead scoring last week. You can find the replay of that on LinkedIn as well on my profile. And you can adjust the score outside of the generic scoring rules to change the score based on this specific form, for example. I say all of this to show that there are different ways that you can use automation after the form is submitted. Depending on what the purpose of your form is for, then you're potentially going to have different completion actions. One thing I'll say, because I seem to see this come up a lot in the engagements that I'm working on, and it's something that's near and dear to me, capture date fields, capture statuses, capture something that at that point in time can help us say, hey, once this thing happened, here are the next series of things that happened. I like to call it like I'm working. I don't want to say I'm working on a concept because that just everyone. I think most people in marketing ops or rev ops or sales ops, all the ops know some of this stuff in terms of data points that are important to collect. I'm really big on date fields because we can start to calculate recency and frequency in terms of how many times things happen. And they can also tell you velocity. How quickly are things moving along after someone does something? So date fields, maybe we'll have another Mike versus on key fields, important fields. I don't know what we'll call it, but we'll do something around fields. Anyway, this is all of Pardot. So again, really good form editor. Go and you can add some rules and some logic to how and when you capture data. You can pick and choose what types of fields you want to use. You can add in your completion actions. I skipped over it, but you can do some good styling. You can add some text below and above your forms. You can include some basic CSS. Is it the most eloquent form editor? I'll let you decide that. There are others that I think are slightly easier to use, but at the end of the day, it's a really powerful tool within Pardot to capture information and make sure that information that is being captured is being processed correctly. So that's Pardot. Let's jump over to Eloqua. Now, Eloqua as well has some best practices that you can pick. Unfortunately, the icons don't seem to be working right now. So if you want to get a starting point in terms of your form, in terms of the fields that you would want to capture on it, potentially some of the post-processing that you want to have there, that's typically included in your best practice forms. But for the purposes of this walkthrough, for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to create a blank form. And I'm going to choose that. And voila, this is the Eloqua form editor. It has changed a lot since I've last seen it, which is great. Let's go through and take a look at what we can do in the Eloqua form editor. So for example, much like we saw in HubSpot, much like we saw in Pardot, you can use contact fields on your form. So if you wanted to bring over email address, for example, I can drag and drop that onto my form editor. I can click on the field and then I get all of my properties around this. Now I'll walk through some properties here in a second outside of email address, just so you can get an idea of what's actually available in the editor. But I can bring over contact fields and use those fields on my form. I can also create custom fields. So this is what I want to focus on a little bit. And I didn't focus on it a ton in HubSpot because HubSpot does it a little bit differently in terms of creating custom contact fields. And same with Pardot, it has to be a prospect field that we're writing to. Eloqua does it a little bit different where you can actually create just HTML fields for your form. And then using field mapping can map that data from the field to a specific contact field in your database. Why would you do that? Well, that's a good question. I'm kind of catching myself. Why would you do that? Why would you create something custom without it necessarily wanting to be in your database? Now there is a small reason. For those that are familiar with Eloqua, you have this idea of form data. Form data is basically like, think of a spreadsheet that you were exporting of everyone that submitted a form. That's what form data is in in Eloqua. It basically is a ledger of everyone that submitted your form and all the field values that were submitted on that form based on the fields that you have on that form. And so you may have data that you don't necessarily want to capture into your contact records, but you want to store in your form submission data because you'll use it elsewhere. I don't know necessarily how you would do that yet. Maybe you export it and re-import it, but then you're importing into some other field. Anyway, you have the ability to create custom fields on your form that are not necessarily contact fields. If you are using fields on your form that are contact fields, then those are typically going to write back to the contact field that you're using. But in lieu of all of that, let's talk a little bit about the properties here. So again, we can update the label that we want to use. So instead of single line text, maybe I call this first name. If I want to add instructions in, I can. This is important for your web developer. If they are mapping data from an external source, or if they're reposting data from somewhere else back into your Eloqua form, this becomes really important. And you can get all this information from all of your forms in HubSpot and in Pardot and in Marketo as well. It's just if someone calls it an HTML name or an API name or an underlying name or a field name or a field ID, this is typically what we're talking about. You can pre-populate the data as well. So you can put in a static value versus a field merge. So this is if we already have information on someone, we can put their information into the form field so that they don't have to fill it out again. And then depending on the type of field that you're creating, you can have different types of validation. You can make your field simply required. It just has to have some value in it. Depending on the type of information you're capturing, if it's an email address, maybe you want to make sure that it's a valid email address in terms of format. If it's a number field, maybe you want to go through and calculate and say how many numbers can you put in, how many characters can you put in, and then you can have your error messages as well. And so you can do that on a field by field basis. You can see up here again, we have our ability to add contact fields. You can create custom fields here as well. You also have field groups. So if you wanted to go through and ask for, say, address, instead of going through and adding all of the address fields in here, Eloqua has done a really nice job and just made these nice little groups for you that have the information that you would typically want to have. And if you need to make changes to them, you just click on the field and you can make those changes as well. If you need to move things around, I think you can move it. You should be able to move it. Can't move it. Okay, no problem. Can't move it. So you have those options here as well. Now, this is the front end of the form. When we talked about Pardot so far, when we've talked about HubSpot so far, we've talked about simple workflows or workflows that are attached to your form in HubSpot. We talked about form completion actions that happen on form handlers or on forms in Pardot. In Eloqua, you have processing steps, which is basically automation built directly on your form. So, for example, if you wanted to capture the information that you were asking for on your form and write it to an Eloqua contact record, you can say, I want to update contacts with form data, and go through and update your field mapping here. Where do you want to map all of this data to? Maybe you want to add someone to a campaign. Add someone to the campaign canvas in Eloqua. You've got a nurture running. You've got a follow-up campaign that's happening based on people submitting this form. You have all of that at your disposal here as well. There's a whole laundry list. You can, again, we're talking basic forms here. I would look at things like sending submitter an email. So sending an autoresponder, you don't need to create any automation for that. You can do it directly off the form. Maybe you want to get a notification whenever someone submits the form. You can do that here as well. Again, I'm not going to go through every single option here in Eloqua, but suffice to say, much like in Pardot, much like in HubSpot, you have control over what happens after that data is submitted. You could do a lot of this stuff in a not in a workflow, on the campaign canvas or on the program canvas, or even program builder in Eloqua as well. Or you can choose to do it directly on the back end of your form. So think of your form kind of like has two sides. You have the front end that everyone else sees. And then when you flip it over, you have the back end, which is what happens with all that data once it comes in. Same concept with HubSpot, Pardot, and Marketo as well. Eloqua just does it directly in the form itself, much like Pardot, where Pardot does these completion actions directly within a form. You can use Engagement Studio in Pardot to trigger any sort of automation as well, much like you can trigger workflows in HubSpot, much like you'll be able to trigger smart campaigns in Marketo, which we'll talk about here in a second. But again, you have the opportunity to go through and add in your processing steps, add in the actions that happen after someone submits the form. You have some logic that you can add, like making things conditional based on certain field values that are being submitted. You can always flip back and forth between between looking at the form and looking at your processing as well. What I haven't gone through up here yet is some of the styling. So again, you can got some basic styling that you can go through and do on your form, like label position, label alignment. You can also go through and get some information about your form. So what's the name of your form? What's the HTML name of your form? Where do you want to store, or what validation page do you want to use if you want to show an error page if someone submits the form incorrectly, for example. You also have the ability, and I'm going to show this up here. I'm not going to dive into it again because I don't want people spamming my forms. I can view the form HTML. And basically what this does is when you build your form in Eloqua, it actually generates all the HTML that you could theoretically just copy and paste and put directly onto a landing page or web page. If you wanted to repost data from your website to Eloqua, Eloqua provides you all that information as well. What's the ELQ site ID, the ELQ? Oh man, I can't remember them all. There's two other hidden fields: ELQ form name and ELQ site ID, and the form action. Those are the three fields that you're going to want to give your web developer. That's going to give them the information that they need to repost data back into Eloqua. Cool, cool, whew. Lots of stuff to cover here. Let me take a quick sip. And I see my LinkedIn is flashing a little bit over here. Let's take a quick peek and see. You know what? No one's watching. That's cool. No problem. We have it on replay. Hopefully folks will watch after. So that's your Eloqua form there. And again, Eloqua, Marketo, HubSpot, Pardot, all look at forms the same way. They've all got the front end side of it and then the back end processing of it. Do a little bit differently. This is how we do it in Eloqua. So you've got your front end form, you've got your processing steps. If you choose to want to build automation outside of it, you can. So yeah, that's an Eloqua form there. Let's jump into building a form in Marketo. So I'm going to create a new form here called testing form. I will share my screen. And this is the form editor in Marketo. So very simple in terms of how you go through and get fields added, but a lot of functionality available to you as well. So you can see here, like most of the platforms, they start you with some of the basics. You got a first name, you have a last name, you have an email address. If you want to add in additional fields, again, kind of like Pardot, kind of like HubSpot, you want to create your text. You want to create your fields first, and then you'll have them referenceable within your form here. So you'll create them as person fields in Marketo, and you'll be able to use that information to capture information on your front end form and then write it back to the relevant person field in Marketo as well. You'll notice for each of the fields that we have properties. So we have our field label, the field name, the field type. How wide do we want this field? Do we want to add any instructions? Do we want to add any hint text? Do we want to add a default value? You're starting to see a lot of these form editors do the same thing in terms of offering out some of the basic form functionality, which is really important. Really, really important. I don't want to sit here and say, well, Eloqua doesn't do this and Pardot doesn't do this. They're doing the basics, and that's the most important part. If you want to take a step up, which I don't know what the step up would be in forms, but if you want to do more, then it's up to kind of working with the platform to figure out what that more is. But from a standpoint of getting started and building a form out of the box, you got the stuff that you need, which is really, really important. If you want to add a validation message, you can customize it. You can use the standard out of the box ones. You can make your field required. So again, that's just if someone has to fill out a first name before the form actually submits. You can determine if you want to pre-fill that form as well. So if you want to pre-populate data that we already have on someone, you can make sure that that's pre-populated in the field as well. So you can go through, you can see how all these different fields pretty much have the same idea to go through. You click on each field, you can modify the properties. If you want to delete a field, simply just delete it. If you want to re-add it back, I'll go and look for first name, add that back, and then maybe I'll move it up here. Perfect. So again, if you want to add more fields, go nuts. You've got all the information that you need here on the side to go through and make sure that you're capturing the data that you need. Marketo also gives you some basic form themes that you can apply to your form. And again, this is saving you from having to go in and do any sort of CSS styling or HTML coding on your forms to get them to look the way that you want to look. So you can see here, we've got 7 different themes or looks and feels that you can use here. You can also go through and add in your own custom CSS here as well. So if you want to have your forms styled a certain way, or you want them to inherit a style sheet that you've already built, you can do that as well. You have a lot of flexibility in terms of how these forms look. At the end of the day, they're really just HTML fields. So any sort of basic styling across any of the platforms is really very much doable. But I've always liked this element with Marketo. I know I didn't say I would say that, but I've always liked this element where if you're not a coder or if you don't have access to a web dev team, you've got some basic themes, some basic look and feels that you can leverage out of the box on your forms here, which is great. Then we have our settings here as well. So what's the language of our form? Where is the form located? Are we doing any sort of progressive profiling on the form? Where do we want the labels to go? What font do we want to use? What's our font size? If we know a visitor, do we want to show a form or do we want to show something different? Interesting. I like this. So it's kind of like progressive profiling, but maybe, because we know who you are, there's something else we want to offer you. Maybe we just shoot you right to the asset that you want to get without having to submit a form. That's not a bad user experience. We still have all that activity information in Marketo. Pretty cool. Thank you page. You can go through, you can say, do you want to redirect to an external page? Do you want to redirect to a landing page that you've already got built within Marketo? Or do you want to just stay on the page right here? Do you want to add any conditions for how and what pages people see? Again, these are all things that you can control in Marketo. You can also control them in the other marketing automation platforms as well. This really reminds me of the mid to early 2000s or mid to late 2000s, where social sign-on, not single sign-on, social sign-on was like a really big thing. So being able to use your Facebook profile to submit a form, or your Twitter profile to submit a form, or your LinkedIn profile to submit a form. And I think what a personal belief, I think what ultimately ended up happening is that people realize that they're not necessarily getting business information from people. They're getting personal information, which not bad. You're getting first name, you're getting last name, but you're potentially not getting things that are important to you for how you segment or look at your database. Things like industry, things like title, things like company size, things like that. You don't typically have that information stored on your Facebook or Twitter profiles, maybe your LinkedIn profile. But again, don't typically see these social form fills nearly as much. But if you're inclined, you've got those options directly within Marketo to do that. And then you can go to your finish here and approve and close. And when you approve and close this, basically what this allows you to do is get an embed script, and you can copy and paste it onto a landing page. You copy and paste it onto your website. You can take elements of it to do a form repost from one site, from one destination to another, so that if your form isn't actually being physically filled in, it's being reposted to for some other post form processing, you can go through and set that up here as well. Now, what you haven't seen in all of this is any sort of automation. And so when we think about Pardot, we have completion actions. When we think about HubSpot, we have the ability to add a simple workflow or build a custom workflow tied to our form. And you can do that outside the form editor as well. In Eloqua, you have processing steps. In Marketo, you have smart campaigns. So smart campaigns, we've talked about these from a lead scoring perspective. We talked about these. We talked about welcome programs. Smart campaigns are the backbone of your automation within Marketo. And so being able to listen to form submissions, so you can set up triggers on your smart campaigns to say, hey, whenever someone submits this form, do these actions, easily done with smart campaigns in Marketo. Gives you all the customization that you would typically want to do within your automation, adding people to a campaign, sending an autoresponder email, sending a notification email, adding someone to a list, adding someone to another smart campaign. You could do them all. You could do them all with smart campaigns. Automation is beautiful. So I would say, yeah, the biggest difference between Marketo versus all of these is that you don't have that automation kind of sitting directly in the editor of your form, which is okay. It's still there. You have smart campaigns and they can do some wild stuff for you. So that's Marketo. Wow. 46 minutes in. I'm going to take another sip of water. I can tell you this is significantly easier than recording or editing and recording Mike versus. I actually quite enjoy this a little bit more. Yeah, this has been fun. This has been a lot of fun going through this. Let me know in the comments on this replay, or if you're watching right now, what other things would you like to see me go through? Right? We've talked about lead scoring. We've talked about forums now. We've talked about welcome campaigns or welcome programs, whatever you want to call it. We can still do things like the email editor, the landing page editor, CRM integration, reporting, basic automation. There's so much more that we can still cover, and there's so much more that we will cover. So hopefully this format seems to stick. This format seems to work. I quite enjoy it. I will keep doing this until people tell me to not do it, which I don't think anybody will. Anyway, thanks for tuning in this week. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with me. If you are here, it feels weird saying that, but if you are here over your lunch hour, or you're just starting your day on the West Coast, thanks so much for joining me. And we'll be back probably next week with another edition of Mike versus Marketing Automation. Have a good one, folks.